organizations being breached. Oops, sorry about that. So we saw a number of commercial organizations across the world start to report that they had been hit by ransomware. At that point, there wasn't a massive amount of information about the type and the method of attack. Interestingly, what happened fairly shortly afterwards is the NHS news started to break that actually a large number of NHS trusts had been compromised, and I think probably slightly unfairly the media sort of went and gave them a big kicking and sort of made this sound like a targeted attack. As you'll sort of see as we go through the attack, this definitely wasn't targeted. The current figures are that there was 220,000 clients compromised in 150 countries around the world, across all verticals, sectors and industries. So there is really very little evidence that this was targeted at all. Another thing that has been massively misreported, and you may even still be reading it today, was that there was a delivery via an email. This is actually incorrectly reported by Fox IT, who actually later revoked their statement. They had mixed up an attack that had happened earlier in the week, known as Jax, and had used the email to deliver Jax to and attached it to this piece of malware. That being said, we are starting to see today, when I had a conversation with some of our industry partners, that these attacks are now being delivered via email. So again, I'm not ruling that out as a delivery mechanism, but I think, you know, we should be accurate as possible with our sort of sharing of information about this. So the attack was not delivered via email, at least in the first instance. So for those who aren't aware, the WannaCry ransomware is being delivered via an Eternal Blue exploit. This is an exploit that was delivered by the shadow, or at least released by the shadow brokers, and is widely believed to be a weaponized piece of malware created by a state-sponsored agency. Obviously, there is no evidence, and nobody has come forward to say, "Hey, we've lost our exploit kit. Please give them back to us." But the complexity and the maturity of these tools would indicate someone who has a large amount of resources and knowledge behind them. And actually, the day sort of ended with a security researcher finding a kill domain. So there was a kill switch found within the ransomware, and what that essentially was a URL. If that URL returned the website address, the ransomware would exit. So interestingly, even though over the weekend we had our largest ever ransomware attack, 220,000 clients, that was really only between 8 o'clock and 4 p.m., which is incredible when we just think about how far it could have gone had that kill switch not been initiated. So, you know, if you ever see that guy at a security conference, we all probably owe the man a beer. So, yeah, I think, again, a bit of misreporting by the media. Somebody tried to say he found it by accident. We'll kind of come on to how he found it a little bit later, but you'll understand why that seems pretty ridiculous shortly. So this is just a bit of a visual timeline, just to show you how the attack propagated through the world. So as you can start to see, boom, and you know, it's definitely not a UK-based attack, and it's definitely not focused. And what you'll see is the intensity of the attack grows and then starts to drop away as we see a second wave. So here comes the second wave coming in shortly. And we believe the waves are actually related to different time zones, because a lot of people are actually were essentially infected via shared WAN environments. So, you know, you might have a small remote site that had SMB exposed. That was the entry point, and then it propagated across internal networks, whether they're WANs, MPLS, whatever that looks like, because people didn't have a lot of internal segmentation. So let's just have a little bit talk about the impact and the scope. So the sort of boring part about WannaCrypt is WannaCry, and also known as WannaCrypt, is the ransomware bit. The ransomware is bulk standard. It encrypts all local shares and local files, and then any mapped network drives. It deletes shadow copies, which again is pretty common for malware these day and ages. So again, very little that is actually interesting or unique about this piece of malware. The bit that is interesting is the delivery mechanism in terms of how it was able to spread. So because it was leveraging the Eternal Blue exploit, which is obviously an SMB exploit, port 445, it was able to essentially execute code on any machine it could reach on that point. That vulnerability, you know, goes all the way back to XP and even further technically, and all the way up to Windows 10 on the client side, and then similar on the server, so Windows 2000 up to 2016. So it has a massive attack surface, and what the Eternal Blue exploit is it's an unauthenticated remote code execution. So that means that you don't need to be authorized as a user, and you can enable code to run on a machine across the network without any sort of interaction from the user at all. We are, well, I'm sort of saying we're advising customers, but you should be advised that you should remain on a high state of readiness. You know, I sort of wrote this on Sunday night, expecting copycats. Well, I can now say we definitely have copycat attacks, and one of the things we are seeing is people changing up the delivery mechanism. So the original attack was delivered only on port 445. These new attacks are coming in via drive-by downloads, via web and email links. So again, you do need to look at those, bringing those defenses up on those internal incoming streams of data. However, again, we wouldn't focus on that being your mitigating technique. Let's make sure that the patches are applied, which we'll kind of talk about in a second. So let's look at remediation first. So all of the sort of major antivirus vendors have now been updated. They all carry the latest signatures for all known WannaCry variants currently. They will help you with any sort of remediation, so they are quite useful to make sure those signatures are updated. They will go and crawl the machines and at least identify any potentially compromised clients. If you stumble upon or get an alert about a client that has the WannaCry malware on it and you go and do some investigation and you find no encrypted files, again, now you owe 2 beers to the man who did the research, because what's happened is you have been saved by the kill switch. So you have found a machine that has got incredibly lucky and essentially tripped the kill switch. So you were infected actually after that sinkhole, which means that you didn't actually have the ransomware actually activate. The biggest one, and the one that I'm sure everyone's looking at it obviously, is that please deploy the MS1701 0 patch. That will remove the vulnerability. As mentioned, this is a far-reaching vulnerability on both the client and the server platform. So that has got to be your main mitigation. Microsoft has released patches for XP and Windows Server 2003. So, you know, go and grab those patches for legacy systems if you still have them. Again, yeah, sort of pretty grateful to Microsoft that they have deviated from their standard patching schedule or standard support schedule to actually support those clients outside of the expected life of them. For those who potentially don't trust their antivirus products or want a bit of belt and braces approach, we have been seeing customers, and we have put together a few PowerShell scripts that you can use to reach across the network and use some of the get process commandlets to look for any of the running processes or locations of network files as they are dropped. You can use those essentially to just scan across the network and make sure that everything is looking okay. However, if you do have your antiviruses and you're running any sort of anywhere near the latest signatures, you'll be more than covered. Again, making sure you're blocking access to the SMB port, so blocking 445, especially on external networks. I'm sure everyone on this call is sort of sitting there going, of course, obviously, like, why would I have potentially SMB exposed to the outside world? I thought a very similar thing. I kind of couldn't believe it a little bit when someone told me it wasn't an email. I was like, nah, you got to be wrong. Come on. But then I did a bit of research, and actually if you go onto Showdown, so showdown.io, for those who don't know, is almost like a Google search engine of port scans. And if you go and look for port 445, I discovered that there is 1 million, so 1 million computers externally presenting port 445. So even if you take off a subset of those being Linux, maybe a subset of those not being vulnerable, it's still a massive attack surface. And when you start to think about that idea of 7 degrees of separation, if every person is only 7 degrees away from each other, I probably can imagine that computers aren't far off that. You can start to see how this attack could potentially get hold on an edge of an unprotected network and just migrate through internal systems, WANs, private connectivity that people have between them. So make sure you are putting those walls up. Think about your external suppliers as well. Have you got managed service providers? Are you a managed service provider? Do you sit on a coin or a local geographic network where you're sharing network space? Make sure when you've got that, ensure you've got a secure boundary, a strong boundary on the edge that at least will protect any sort of cross-network traffic. If you're recovering machines, take an image. So, as I mentioned earlier, we don't see any signs of there being anything wrong with the cryptography. However, given the scale of the attack, a lot of very clever people are jumping up and down on the crypto and the implementation. And should they find something in 6 weeks or a couple of months, you'd much rather you kept the data, because at least you have the option to decrypt it then if you've not paid the ransom or recovered from a backup. So again, something just worth considering if you have been affected. How could we have prevented the attack? So what can we learn from this? So the attack spread using a known vulnerability. Again, a little bit of misreporting when it first started. There was a lot of talk of 0-day and sort of targeted attack. Again, no, it wasn't. It was very much a known exploit. The vulnerability had been out for 2 months. Sorry, the patch had been out for 2 months. So we're advising people to make sure they're starting to build a bit of policy, and this is, working with the business to understand what is your SLA to the business around patch deployment. So the patch was rated as a critical patch, so it was ranked and sort of identified by Microsoft as really important. Patches to be rated critical must contain an unauthenticated remote code execution, which, as I mentioned, is the way that we're able to execute arbitrary code on a remote system without being logged in or having the user do anything. It is the worst of all the security exploits. And interestingly, the critical patches are pretty few and far between. So this year we've only seen 2, of which this attack is one of. Last year we saw, I think it was over 10, but less than sort of 15. So we're not talking about massive patches here. This is not stability or program updates. This is real core security stuff. So build an SLA. Say, well, actually, as our organization, we will patch in X number of days, X number of weeks, X number of months, whatever is appropriate to your organization. And then make sure you stick to that unless you get authorization for a deviation. What that starts to do is then you start to be able to understand what your attack window is. Once you understand what the attack window is, you can start to apply some risk management methodologies to that to understand, well, how long will we be exposed for. Make sure you're relying on automated tools, SCCM, WSUS, to help you deploy those updates. I think we'll start to potentially see some of this go away as people move to 10. Windows 10 obviously pushes a lot more automated updates and starts to remove that control away from the user or even the organization using Windows 10. So I think we're going to have to start to get used to pushing more patches and maybe becoming more comfortable with the level of risk. However, I have spent 6 years working with public sector, so I am more than friendly with application incompatibility and things not running with certain patches. So what we're advising customers to do is, if you do have systems like that, consider maybe delivering them in an alternative methodology. So can you use VDI? Can you use app streaming? Can you use app wrapping to sort of abstract away the application from the underlying operating system? And what that will allow you to do is to then start to patch those systems without as much fear of breaking the app compatibility. Again, this will depend on what your business does and your risk and your sort of appetite to risk and your risk profile. But I would definitely recommend that you explore that versus just not applying patches. So the crazy thing about this attack is, it very much highlighted how poorly segmented most network environments are. I think very interestingly, networks are built by network guys, and they're very rarely built by security people. So, we've got perfectly sized broadcast domains, but there's no ACLs. So, one of the things that we're not doing is we're not looking at what services need to exist between different VLANs. Do you need SMB between 2 client VLANs? Is there ever a reason for that? Again, considering deploying private VLANs, I know a number of security people have sort of said, wow, like private VLANs would have given a lot of protection. So, and what a private VLAN is, it's a VLAN where the client can only see itself and the uplink. So it's a little bit like client separation, which is a wireless-based technology, but that it works on wired networks as well. There is a bunch of caveats and downsides to private VLANs, and we'll cover that on the slide in a couple of slides' time, which is a little bit later. But you'll start to explain as to why, as to why that's useful. And again, network inspection. One of the things we definitely saw with this attack was people really had little to no visibility. Considering half of this happened almost at layer 2, there was no routers, there was no firewalls, there was almost no logs to some extent in some of our clients. So because it didn't come up to that edge security boundary, people suddenly didn't have a lot of information. So consider using things like NetFlow or SFlow information from your edge switches, and at least from your distribution layer, to start to actually give you a much more complete view of your network traffic. So one of my favorite things we're going to talk about today is FSRM, so File System Resource Manager. Massively underutilized and underloved piece of software from Microsoft. We'll kind of come on to it in more detail, but essentially it is a role you deploy which enables you to do an if then that based on file conditions. So detection of certain file activity allows you to automate the removal of shared permissions to someone. So it gives you an element of proactive control. And then finally, and sort of at the bottom of my list, is consider deploying endpoint solutions to give you signatureless detection methods. I would rather, this was the last thing you did, if I'm honest, and get everything else in order, get best practice design in terms of security architecture from a networking perspective, patch systems. But, it should be said that a lot of the endpoint vendors, as they've been sort of waving their arms around today, they did do pretty well, and they did defend against these attacks. Again, we're not going to go into which ones are good, which ones are bad, but yeah, that information is out there, and they did stand up relatively well. Just interestingly, on the rate of infection, I sort of said it covered 220,000 clients in 150 countries. At the peak of the infection, we were actually seeing about 27,000 new infections every minute. So that was roughly 1,000 machines a minute, which is an incredible number, and really that is to do with the distribution model of the malware. Every machine it compromises does itself then go out and actually look to exploit further machines, so you get that sort of logarithmic or that hockey stick effect in terms of a rapidly increasing rate of infection, which was really interesting to see. I mean, it was incredibly vicious when it was fully going, and then obviously you can see when the dip when the kill switch was enabled. So yeah, really incredible. So we're just going to come on to a little bit of a deeper technical analysis here. So as I've sort of mentioned at the beginning, we were not going to talk about an email vector because it didn't exist. But what happened is the SMB exploit injects a dropper. So it brings along a piece of code blob that is the dropper for the malware. It then uses the remote code execution to execute that on that system. It executes with full system privileges, so there's no need for any sort of authenticated access. Excuse me. This drops 2 files. And the attack is actually split into almost 2 sides. So one of the files goes on and checks the kill switch, and then it creates a service which goes across the network and scans for port 445. And this is essentially the worm element of it. And this is the bit that's going to go and find other machines, infect them, and drop the dropper over to them. The other part that's dropped is almost much more traditional. It is the ransomware element. That's going to enumerate any of the drives, which includes local drives and any map network drives. It's then going to bring down Tor. So Tor was used for the command and control infrastructure. Again, if you have got a layer 7 firewall that's able to detect Tor traffic, you might want to consider at least alerting on it or potentially blocking that. Again, I wouldn't recommend that as the sort of be-all and end-all of your security, but it is a pretty good indicator of compromise depending on the infrastructure you work in. But typically, most organizations wouldn't expect to see Tor traffic running across them. They drop a couple more files. These are mainly related to the user experience, for want of a better word. So they let the user know it's been encrypted, and they provide the decryption software should the key and the ransom be paid. And then finally, the malware deletes the shadow copies on the machine. So that's sort of the last stage, removes those elements, and then essentially stops. So there's a really good and very detailed blog from Talos, which is the Cisco security team, which sort of runs at about 1,600 words. So if you want to get down into the weeds, there's a lot of information out there. I'd recommend all your security guys go and study this, because at the end of the day, we only get better by looking at the attacks, looking at how they work, and looking at the methodologies. And what I'd always recommend customers do is they take that methodology and they apply it against their own infrastructure. I hope everyone today has spent their day doing what-ifs, because that's the only way we build better systems. So just to talk a little bit more about the kill switch. So as I said, a lot of the press reported about this accidental find of a kill switch. I don't know how many people accidentally decrypt an exploit binary and go through the opcode manually and work out how to stop the kill switch. But apparently this man is incredibly lucky. So essentially what he did was he decrypted the binary. He looked at the operation code and found that jump there that says, okay, well, make an open URL, and then there's in the bracket is essentially the URL code there. So what that does is that looks to see if that URL is there, and if it is, the code leaves. Now, the interesting thing about this is not because it wasn't put in because someone had some conscience or wanted to sort of stop the attack down the road. What it's there for is sandbox detection. So a lot of sandboxes are used in organizations to emulate files to try and make them do bad things to make it easier to then detect that they're a malicious file. But one of the tricks malware authors do to bypass these systems is they essentially have URLs in there that they know shouldn't respond. And what the sandboxes do is to collect as much information as possible, they basically respond on all URLs. because they want them to then reply with a piece of CNC traffic or a piece of malware code that they can go, oh yeah, that's dodgy, therefore this file is dodgy even though we don't have a signature for it. So that was the reason for the code existing. What the malware author didn't do, which is unusual, is usually what happens is they register the domain still. And usually they register it and still just don't put a server behind it, which still gives the same effect of not being there. However, what happened was they hadn't actually registered this domain, so the malware researcher went and got his credit card out, put 15 quid on GoDaddy, and actually took down probably the largest malware botnet, or sorry, not botnet, ransomware attack that the world's ever seen. So fair play to him. However, one thing that I should mention is version 2 came out on Saturday, so a second variant. That variant used a different kill switch URL, which was subsequently taken down. We've now seen subsequent versions have no kill switch at all. So again, I wouldn't be relying on that as a methodology to protect you, but it is sort of an interesting asset of this attack. So a little bit on to about private VLANs now. So private VLANs enforce isolation of the clients from each other. Pretty much when you run a private VLAN, all you can see is the endpoint and the uplink. So this creates a really tight security environment. Again, this is can be deployed on a broad range of different systems and is widely supported across most switching vendors. The thing to be aware of, though, is if you have that client separation turned on, you're not going to be able to have any sort of intra-VLAN communication. So if there's printer server scanners that sit on the same VLAN, it's obviously going to break. I did this presentation this morning to our network architect, who sort of gave me a bit of a kick. I'd totally forgotten about something, and they called me up, said, Adam, what have you forgotten about? And the answer is soft phones. That's the real kicker, because soft phones share the same IP address as the device they're running on, and because of latency, all soft phones want to make a direct communication between the sender and the recipient. So it kind of puts in a bit of spam into the works, otherwise it would sort of make sense to deploy these everywhere. However, if your infrastructure is suitable or you're operating in an environment where you're happy to lose that functionality maybe for a short period of time, it is still something to consider. Okay, so just finally, we're just going to talk a little bit more detail about FSRM. So FSRM, as I mentioned, Windows role can be deployed on anything from 2008 all the way up to the latest 2016, and allows you to create these things called file groups. And what they essentially are is a pattern match against either the extension or the file name. It allows you to take a range of different actions, including invoking scripts, creating emails. So a lot of people create these, have it email an alert to a certain port, and then remove the malware from remove the share access from the infected client. So it's a proactive automated defense. It starts to really help where you don't have 24-hour help desks. And also what it does is it makes the recovery much more simple, because actually you're only going to have to be recovering maybe 3 or 4 files rather than a whole encrypted drive. I've given a link down to the bottom to Experian. They're not anyway connected to Softcat, but they provide a bunch of scripts you can download on GitHub. They will basically PowerShell scripts. They automatically download or essentially get Windows to download the role, install it. And the clever bit they do is they bring down daily file extension lists. So I have an organization I know very well who uses this. They were very, very happy because on Friday morning it brought down the latest version, and guess what was on it? WannaCry. So they only lost a few files. So it's massively important for them, a real win. If you're pretty handy with some scripting, you can sort of take this to the next stage, and I've seen a number of organizations start to automate the creation of help desk tickets. So it's all well and good dropping your file share out, but can you create a help desk ticket that will then contain the information about why you've been locked out of something along with the files that have been encrypted for you, and can you take that a step further and actually start to automate recovery of those files? So you're still going to lose 1 or 2 files as part of this, because it does need to see that activity before it steps in, but can you automate the recovery of that? I know a number of organizations are starting to offer a ransomware SLA to their users. You know, how quickly can we recover from these types of attacks, because they're not going anywhere. And yeah, I mean, they've got a lot of common terminology, but they're pretty much known in the industry as crypto canaries. So sort of great bits of kit and really, really useful. The last point on FSRM is that you might want to consider deploying at the top and the bottom of everyone's files is 2 folders, 2 hidden folders. They both contain like a lot of common files that are often encrypted, pictures, movies, documents, things like that. And what they'll do is they almost act as a bit of a runway. So these files that are useless to the user get encrypted before it actually hits into their directory, which gives you an opportunity to potentially have FSRM lock the user out and there'd be no file loss. The reason I don't sort of immediately tell you to do that is I wouldn't rely on it, because we're starting to see malware and ransomware encrypt randomly. So rather than either starting at the top, which you did, then they switched it up and started from the bottom, it's now gone to just randomly grabbing the files. So again, don't rely on it. Always expect, if you use this tool, that there may be some element of file loss. And that sort of formulates the end of the sort of formal part of the presentation. We'll now go into some Q&A. So I'm just going to have a look and see what questions are being asked. Bear with me 1 second.